31st, and that meant that Thursday, October 15th, was the last day to be counted in the 2020 census. For more than 3 years, the Leadership Conference Education Fund Census Counts campaign that Beth Link has been leading has been working with a network of civil rights advocates, local officials, librarians, faith leaders, and more than 500 organizations in all 50 states and the District of Columbia to get out the count, especially in communities that have been historically missed. And it's been quite an effort. It's been really a yeoman's effort. And the 2020 census was the largest, most difficult enumeration in our nation's history from the outset. It was only made more difficult by the pandemic, by natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires, but also, and we have to note this, by the Trump administration's repeated efforts to sabotage the count for political gain. The administration's refusal to let the Census Bureau experts, the career experts, determine the best schedule for completing the count and reporting results really created enormous chaos and confusion in the field. It undoubtedly undermined the work that we needed to do and tried to do to encourage marginalized communities to participate in the 2020 census. But the census isn't over, and it would be a mistake for anyone in the public or in the media to think that the census is over. What is over is the data collection phase of the census. Now that the Census Bureau has finished collecting the data from 150 million housing units and thousands of group facilities, from people experiencing homelessness or living in transitory locations like RV parks, the Bureau has actually moved into the next phase and begun that painstaking, complex work, highly specialized series of activities to process and improve the accuracy of the raw data. This work is crucial and it cannot be shortchanged. The Bureau faces an impossible deadline of December 31st, 2020 to review, process, tabulate, and report 2020 census reapportionment and redistricting data. That's according to the Bureau's own experts. You don't need to take it from me, but the Bureau's own experts, the Government Accountability Office, and the Commerce Department's Inspector General have stated how important and crucial it is for the Bureau to have additional time to do this very important data processing phase. The Census Bureau experts have been clear. Rushing the census is going to force the Bureau to cut corners and compress vital quality check activities, skewing census data for a decade, I should say, although the ramifications will last decades. An internal Census Bureau document actually warned that a rushed census could create, quote unquote, serious errors in the data. According to the CUNY Mapping Service, self-response rates in communities of color nationwide still tend to be lower than non-Hispanic white communities, and also tend to be lower than the US self-response rate overall. And the majority of census tracts that are predominantly Black, Hispanic, or American Indian, and a substantial tract of Asian tracts still have response rates that are less than the final rates in these same areas in 2010. This means that communities of color needed a greater share of door knocking enumeration and actually would have benefited from extra time. So in short, the risk of undercounts or data quality concerns fall disproportionately on communities of color. And let me just be clear about this, an inaccurate and incomplete 2020 census is going to hurt every state in the country, not just communities of color, but every state in the country. That's why Congress has to set a clear path forward. And the Leadership Conference, our big coalition of more than 200 organizations and many others are calling on Congress to take urgent action to push back the deadline for reporting apportionment and redistricting data by 120 days each, as the Trump administration itself had requested back in April before withdrawing that support. Even if Congress can't vote on the extensions now, we are urging leaders from both parties to let the Commerce Secretary and the Census Director know that they will push back the reporting deadlines, especially for apportionment, at the earliest legislative opportunity in a lame duck session. And the Bureau urgently needs more time to process the data. There's a bipartisan bill to save the census. It was introduced in the Senate by Senators Lisa Murkowski, Dan Sullivan, and Brian Schatz. The two senators from Alaska, one from Hawaii. The leadership conference endorsed this bill and the bipartisan House companion. There really isn't a roadmap for what comes next if the Census Bureau is forced to produce an inaccurate 2020 census. The bottom line is that without action from Congress, the Census Bureau is guaranteed to miss millions of people across every state, including people on rural and tribal lands, people of color, people with low incomes, and people experiencing homelessness, and therefore produce skewed data that is going to hurt our communities for a decade. In a lot of ways, this has always been the Trump administration's goal, from the failed citizenship question to Trump's unconstitutional memo trying to erase undocumented immigrants from the count or for congressional apportionment. The administration has been trying over and over again to dictate who counts in this country. And there's a domino effect at play. If you actually erase people from the census, the very tent poles of our democracy, like federal programs and fair elections, start to fall. Congressional action is the only way to safeguard the data in our democracy. Thank you all again for joining. I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Arturo Vargas, Chief Executive Officer of NALEO Educational Fund. Arturo?
Thank you, Vanita. Can you hear me? Thank you. I am the CEO of the NALEO Educational Fund, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to promote the full participation of Latinos in American democracy. And given that the census is the foundation of that democracy, having a fair and accurate count is at the core of the mission of my organization. And make no mistake about it, there has never been an accurate count of Latinos in the decennial census of the United States. Going back to the first census that included a Hispanic origin question in 1980, there have been efforts in every single census to undercount the Latino community, despite the fact that there are extreme barriers already that create such an undercount. In 1990, there were efforts, litigation and legislation to prevent the inclusion of undocumented immigrants in that decennial count. In the 2000 census, our efforts to allow the scientists at the Census Bureau to correct the census data to make up for the undercount were prohibited from going forward. In the 2010 census, there were calls for immigrants to boycott the census. And now in 2020, we have had a political interference by the administration at levels that we have not seen in any of those previous censuses, with efforts to include a citizenship question, now the political interference of the administration of the Department of Commerce and the workings of the Census Bureau that we've seen over the past 6 months. And of course, the multiple disasters of the COVID pandemic, wildfires in states with large Latino populations, including California and Colorado and Oregon and Washington, and other natural disasters such as hurricanes in states including Florida and Texas that also have large Latino populations. So in many respects, the odds are consistently against a census that fully includes all Latinos, which is why NALEO Educational Fund, with hundreds of other Latino and non-Latino organizations, joined together to do everything we could to ensure that every single American resident was counted in the census, including all 60 million Latinos. The census isn't over. We've done all we can now to have people complete their census forms. And we know that given all the barriers that have been faced, the lingering effects of the political interference, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that have disproportionately affected Latino households and families, that response rates in heavily Latino areas have been far below those of other parts of the country. So the fact that the Census Bureau touts a 99% completion rate of having counted all households is simply one that not only is it hard to believe, it is really not true. The Census Bureau may have touched 99% of the households on its address list, but we have no idea if everybody who lives in those households were included in the census. We have no idea if those census forms are actually complete with all the information that was supposed to be submitted. And we don't even know if that address list that the Census Bureau compiled included all addresses, even households without a U.S. postal mailing address, which is why every single element of the census is important, and why this next phase is even more critical for Latinos, the data processing phase. Now is the time for the Census Bureau to be able to fill in the blanks and complete the process by processing the data. The Census Bureau needs to go back and look at all these forms and determine which forms are incomplete, which forms indicated that there were family members for which there was no room to include the information, for which the Census Bureau has to go back and try to obtain information about those individuals. The Census Bureau now has to unduplicate responses that may have been submitted more than once from a single household. All this data processing is absolutely essential, especially for those population groups that are historically undercounted, like Latinos. And the fact that the administration is attempting to reduce the amount of time that the Census Bureau experts say they need to finish the job is further undermining a fair and accurate census. This is why we continue to call on Congress to take up its constitutional responsibility as being the entity that has the responsibility to ensure that a census is carried out every 10 years and extends the statutory deadlines for the delivery of the apportionment data from December 31st to April 31st, and the delivery of the redistricting data from April 1 to July 1. This will give the Census Bureau sufficient time to make sure it completes the processing and does what it can to include everybody who was not included in the initial self-response period. So the work isn't over, and at NALEO, we will continue working with our partners to ensure that we do all we can to salvage this foundation of our democracy. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, John Yang, with Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
Great. Thank you very much, Arturo. And thank you to my colleagues, Arturo and Vanita, for all the great work that you guys are doing. My name is John Yang. I am the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We are part of an affiliation of 5 independent organizations in DC, Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The mission of Advancing Justice, AAJC, is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. Look, the decennial census sets a standard for data quality that must be preserved and should be something that the U.S. Census Bureau achieves without interference. Instead, the Trump administration has made countless efforts to sabotage this census, to erase historically undercounted communities, especially those which have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Make no mistake, the Trump administration has been deliberately undermining the census for purely partisan political gain. Now that the Supreme Court has allowed the census count to end early, the Bureau needs to undertake the massive and complex task of processing the raw data that it has collected related to 150 million housing units and other locations into data that accurately reflects each of our communities. This data is so important that the Asian American community, the fastest growing community in the United States, and other allied communities on this call, because it translates to real resources in our neighborhoods, real changes for our communities, and real implications for our political representation for the next 10 years. The post-data collection processing that we have been talking